Darling one, you were born from the sweetest love, cast from the fires of creation, burning bright into the making of your perfect constellations. Head high, my love, never let them diminish you. Stand tall in the power of your love. Break open to the thousands come before you, written in your heart with holy blood. Keep going, my love. Hold tight to the scripture of your inheritance, your dreams born from ancient stone. Weave your magic star of wisdom, breathing life into hollow bones. Courage, my love. Place pain upon your sacred altars. Grow seeds where life has become hopeless. Lend hands to those who fall and falter. Let love be life's greatest opus.
Welcome, beautiful souls. My name is Tara Brading, and I'm the creator of the Dreaming the Ancestors podcast series, where we talk about remembering and reclaiming ancestral stories, feminine wisdom, and earth magic. And today I'm so excited to introduce you to Anthony Murphy to talk about Ireland's ancient astronomers. Anthony Murphy is a journalist, author, photographer, astronomer, and tour guide from Drogheda in County Louth. He has published 9 books, non-fiction as well as fiction, inspired by the mythology and cosmology of the great Neolithic monuments of the Boyne Valley. In 2018, he discovered the remains of a giant late Neolithic henge close to Newgrange using his drone. And in 2021, he found 2 previously unrecorded dugout boats in the River Boyne at Drogheda. He curates the Mythical Ireland website and social media channels and broadcasts a weekly live stream. He's married to Anne and they have 5 children. So as always, I'd like to just take this moment for us to all close our eyes and just imagine that we're having this conversation in the flesh, heart to heart, that we're sitting on the ground around a great fire and we're sharing wisdom, we're sharing stories, just like our ancestors have done since time immemorial. And just really feeling ourselves in presence here, coming into circle, gathering from our many different corners of the globe. And as we're holding this vision in our hearts and minds, being gathered around the fire, I'd like to take a moment to call in the ancestors. So I would like to welcome in my ancestors of blood and bone, my wise and well ancestors. And I'd also like to call in the wise and well ancestors of all of us who are here today, really feeling our ancestors gathering around us, supporting us as we remember these ancient ways, this ancient wisdom, and feeling our ancestors really greeting and connecting with one another, really honoring our similarities more than our differences, and feeling that love of the ancestors as this river of memory that flows through each and every one of us. I would also like to honor the ancestors of the lands where I'm on, so honoring the Ute and Arapaho peoples who were the original peoples of where I live here in Colorado. And I'd also like to honor the ancestors of the lands of Ireland, who are such an important part of our conversation today, as we really imagine how the ancient ancestors really viewed the skies, the wisdom that they held about the sacred cycles as ancient astronomers. So I call in all of these ancestors to be with us today, really feeling our connection with the unseen world and the place of the ancestors. Sha Nilabikas. Okay, so
The title of this episode is Ireland's Ancient Astronomers. And I just want to begin by saying that Anthony has so much amazing wisdom to share on this topic. And there is no doubt that our ancient Irish ancestors were fascinated with the skies. There's both archaeological evidence of this from the Neolithic age, where ancient burial mounds like Brunaboyne and Knowth and Douth and other sites in the Boyne Valley and beyond are aligned to specific astrological events in the year. There's also astrological symbolism and significance in lots of the Irish myths. And, there's also a living tradition of sacred celebration around the wheel of the year, as it's sometimes called, at the solstices, the equinoxes, and the cross-quarter days. And before we begin this conversation, I'd really like for everyone listening to imagine living in a time when there was no artificial light, when there was true darkness in the sky, when there were no high-rise buildings blocking your view of the heavens, a time when you knew exactly where the sun would rise at different times of the year, when you could recognize the constellations and the planets, and you would sit outside at night and watch their movements across the skies. In the modern world, so many of us have become disconnected from the skies. We've kind of lost our bearings, so to speak. But Anthony is really someone who has reconnected with this wisdom in such a beautiful and meaningful way. So, Anthony, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey. How did you get interested in the astronomy and the movements of the planets? When did you become interested in the ancient sites of Ireland? And did one come before the other? And how did you start pairing these things together? So that's sort of a multitude of questions.
And actually, it's very apt because really you can't start a discussion about the ancient astronomers without that sort of personal touch. So I was born and have grown up and have lived my whole life in this town, which is Drogheda. It currently has about 41,000 inhabitants. When I was a kid, it had about 20,000. It's grown sizably in my lifetime. I came to the stars, I first encountered the stars through a library book that I borrowed. One of these sort of children's guidebooks to the stars. I have some on my shelves. This kind of thing, stars and planets, where there's a page with each constellation and a description. And I brought this book home, right? And this is what happened. I remembered very well. It was January. I think it was 1981. So I was 7. That'll tell you how old I am or how young I am. Age is always relative. And I was looking at the page about Orion. And so I sat on the floor of the sort of kitchen of my house that I grew up in. And I looked out the window. And there, on the crispest, clearest, very cold January night, were these brilliantly shimmering stars of Orion. And I was looking and I was going, oh, wow, this is amazing. Of course, it happens that the first constellation that I came to really recognize is actually probably the most brilliant constellation. There are very few that have so many bright stars and have such a distinctive, immediately recognizable pattern. And that was how it started. I was just literally gobsmacked immediately, and I'm writing a book about that at the moment. When I say I'm writing a book about it, that's on hold because I've been writing so much other stuff. But I've written 71,000 words of a book that's about astronomy, but it deals with this, how do you get into it? Where does it start? And how does one become hooked on it? Well, your question is very interesting, and your discussion of, this detachment that we suffer from, because it's like a disease, it's an ailment, this detachment from nature and from the heavens. Even in the town of Drogheda, which wasn't a big town by international standards, we still had a lot of light pollution. And I remember being out in the garden and constantly the glare of lights, floodlights from the port, because my house overlooked the river where the port was. And you had to try and kind of shield yourself from these lights to get a good view of the sky. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I visited with my family, friends out in Connemara. And they lived in Westport on the west coast, close to Croagh Patrick. But they had a holiday home, sort of a small cottage on the shore of Loch Cara in the wilds of Connemara. And at around 11 o'clock at night, myself and some of my siblings and some of the kids from the other family, we opened the window and sneaked out into the garden. And when I say it was my first real experience of several things, a sense of wilderness, complete and utter darkness, apart from the little light that shone out of the windows of the cottage, and lack of street lights and car lights and everything. And I looked up at the sky, and it was a clear night. It was in summer, and I was mesmerized. I was totally, my breath caught. I couldn't believe that there were so many more stars to be seen in the sky than I could see at home in Drogheda. And really at that stage, I was completely and utterly hooked. What I had done, and what I've done often in the meantime, is I had made a connection. You talk about ancestors. I think when you get out into wilderness and you get away from cities and the madness of modern human existence, you're in a sense of timeless enrapture. You're captivated wholeheartedly and totally by this experience. Providing, put the phone away, put the phone into the pocket, keep the camera by the side, whatever other bits and pieces you have with you, put them away, and just, if you can, lie back on the grass and just look at that vast cosmos that is above our heads every night if we wanted to. And that is still available to a lot of people. It's just that us humans, being the sort of creatures that we are, we like our own company. So most of the world's population congregates in cities, and most of those cities are in coastal areas. So you kind of have to get into, well, I'm not sure if there's anywhere on the east coast of the States. I was in the States 2 winters ago. I was in New York, I was in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and New Jersey. And I could only see the very brightest of stars. I thought I had it hard in Drogheda. I didn't have it hard at all. Anyway, your other question was, how did I... the monuments, literally, I should tell your viewers, like if I was to be able to pass through that bookcase and float out through the sky 4 miles, 4.1 miles actually, as the crow flies, Newgrange, the great monument, is in that direction 4 miles away. And as a kid, it's very difficult when you're growing up in Drogheda not to be aware, because the excavations of Newgrange, which were in the 60s and the 70s, and then some excavations in the 80s, and now right from the 1960s through to the early 2000s. And so all the information that was coming about, that they were older than we had believed before, and the megalithic art, and it was stunning. And it was on a school trip, actually, to Newgrange and Dowth. I remember very, very distinctly climbing to the top of Dowth, feeling that I had climbed a mountain, because I was only a child, and this thing seemed enormous to me. And just being sort of fairly fascinated about, wow, there were people in Ireland who built these things. And so later, a combination of questions was, when you read the astronomy books, you read that the first astronomers were the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Chinese, and then, the Arabs and the Greeks and the Romans, and all our constellation names are derived from Arabic and, Greek, etc., etc. And I was like, surely, hang on a second, if there were people in Ireland 5,000 years ago building great monuments, surely they had their own constellations. And of course, that was a question that really got set into motion in 1999 when I met my good friend, well, he's now my good friend, Richard Moore, the artist, because he wanted to know from me. He said, do you think there's more astronomy going on at these monuments than the experts have kind of revealed? And I said, I have that sense, yes, because Newgrange is aligned on the winter solstice sunrise. Many of your viewers will probably know that. But it's like, it doesn't stop there. And as an astronomer who became keenly aware of things like the way the sun moves through the zodiac and the way the moon is tilted to that and the way some of the planets move erratically, all of those things came together. And myself and Richard published a book together, first published in 2006 and reprinted and actually republished last year. And that's called Island of the Setting Sun, in Search of Ireland's Ancient Astronomers. To be honest, in 1999, when I met Richard, and in all the years before that, if you'd said to me, you're going to write books about these monuments and astronomy, I would have said, no, absolutely not, because all the experts have written the books already. But I did realize over time that I felt there was a gap in the knowledge, particularly pertaining to the astronomical expertise, that there was more there than, because the archaeologists are not trained in astronomy, and if they don't have the background that I have in astronomy, they're unlikely to know the intricacies and the things that might be involved. So it's been a great journey, and I hope that's answered your questions. And I'm sorry for rabbiting on.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Anthony. And wow, yeah, I loved just feeling your sense of awe at looking at the stars and seeing how many more stars you could see when you're in the wilderness of Connemara. It was beautiful. And yeah, I actually had an experience a few years ago where I actually went to a planetarium. And, I kind of just went with some friends, wasn't expecting anything too meaningful. But there's this moment at the beginning where they showed what the sky looks like with light pollution. And then they said, this is what it would look like if there was no light pollution. And it changed drastic. I literally started crying because I was like, this is such a disconnection for us, because for me, to know the stars is to know ourselves on some level. Where I live in Colorado, we have there are some places in particular where you can see just so many stars. Yeah.
Imagine. Yeah. In this day and age, we're not just competing with light pollution, we're actually also competing with atmospheric pollution,
Mm.
which is a substantial issue that wasn't around, say, in Stone Age times.
Yeah.
And it's those occasions when you can get to, like, even in Ireland, we still have what we call officially recognized dark sky sites. One of them is in County Kerry on the southwestern coast of Ireland, facing out over the Atlantic Ocean. Next stop, Brazil, and one of them is in Tyrone in Northern Ireland, far away from city lights. And so there are occasions like that time when I was a kid at the cottage at Loch Cara, where you can get a sense of that, a real deep sense of that awe. That I often say that it's a transcendent experience. It is actually a divine experience. Mm-hmm. Because you see, I was interested in the science of astronomy. As a kid, I could rhyme off all the facts and figures, and they're fascinating. The speed of light, the size of the sun, the distance from, say, the sun or the Earth to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, 4 light years, and how long it would take you to travel there at the speeds that our spacecraft can currently go at. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, you realize that the universe is achingly enormous. I mean achingly, as in everything is too far away. Everything is too far away. It is meant to be seen, but not to be reached, I think. That could change. And it might change even in our lifetimes. I don't know, because we've begun, as Carl Sagan said in his book, Cosmos, we've begun to take those tentative steps out onto the shores of the cosmic ocean, realizing that when you're standing on the shore of a beach and the water's washing over your feet, that water extends over 2/3 of the surface of the Earth, and in some cases is miles and miles deep. And there's an enormous volume of it, such that, if you were to try and count the water droplets of the oceans of the world, I don't know how many billions of years you'd be counting, but you'd certainly be counting for a long time. And that only gives you just a pale idea, a vague idea of the vastness of the universe. But in addition to the science, there is that entirely different psychological, spiritual, mystical side to it, which is why we have astrology as well as astronomy, because it is very difficult. And I'm sure loads of your viewers have had experiences like we have had. Everybody, I think, has had that, or a lot of people. If you're unfortunate enough never to have left a big city, then you need to find your way out into the wilderness, if only for one night of your life, to see the things and the beauties that are there. And so there's that whole other aspect to it, which I felt was expressed in a way in the monumental architecture of the ancient Boyne Valley Stone Age, that these were people who weren't merely scientists, nor were they merely mystics. They were a people for whom there was maybe there was no I often say it was crossover between science and spirituality. Maybe for them there was no distinction between them. But I'll tell you, it's very, very difficult not to. I mean, I've been at a lot of Irish historic and ancient and sacred sites, And I've tried to be at many of them at twilight and into the darkness of the night, and it's an entirely different sense and experience than the daytime experience. Entirely different. And there are moments when you literally feel like you have entered eternity, which is something that I've written about, that sense of timelessness. Because the cosmos, while life on Earth ticks by at a phenomenal rate, and the days whiz by, and we grow up very quickly, and 1 minute we're a youngster, next minute we're an adult, and then next minute we're in old age, contemplating what's next, But the cosmos seems to remain still. Of course, we know now it doesn't, but constellation shapes don't change much over 50,000 years, for instance. The brightness of stars, except for those fluctuating variable stars, doesn't change. So there's something very fixed about them. So when you go out into those wildernesses and you look at Orion tonight, or you look at the Big Dipper, or you look at, Gemini or Cygnus or Cassiopeia or whatever it happens to be, you're looking at the same stars that your distant ancestors watched 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and possibly even 50,000 years ago and longer. And I think that's one of the things that, when you go somewhere and you get a sense that you're standing on the earth, like at Newgrange, you get a sense you're standing on sacred ground. This ground was sacred to people more than 5,000 years ago. But you see, when you look at the stars, that is utterly unchanged by human hands or human interference, human physical force. Like we have chopped down forests in prehistory to build those monuments. We change the landscape to suit ourselves. You can't change the landscape of the stars. They are, as I said, out there, beautiful to behold, achingly sore to watch because of that feeling that, maybe somebody standing in this spot maybe 1 million years ago was watching those stars, and they seem to be totally unchangeable.
Yes, it's so interesting. In my monthly membership, which is called Wild and Wise, this month we've been looking at the wisdom of the stars, and I've been guiding women on journeys to connect with the stars, and some of the reflections that come back are just this deep sense of peace and steadiness and home even, and it's just so beautiful to witness that. And my next question for you, Anthony, is really, since you started to talk about the ancient astronomers in Ireland and the sacred sites, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about some of the sophisticated stone technology and ritual practices of ancient Ireland that were used to track the movement of the stars and the planets. So in other words, like, what were some of the methods used by Ireland's ancient astronomers? And I know there's a lot to say, but just whatever feels most meaningful.
Yeah, what's really interesting about the great monuments of Brú na Bóinne, which is the complex of the Bend of the Boyne, dedicated, by the way, often translated as the Palace of the Boyne, as in the river. But the scholars often forget the fact that the Boyne River was a deity, a feminine deity. And that's extremely important in trying to decipher and decode the spirituality of the people who built them, I think. And that is subjective, by the way, because there's very little objective evidence. Well, they're not like the pyramids. Newgrange and Nowth and Doubt are all what we call mega mounds, humongous passage tombs or chambered cairns, each around 90 or 100 meters in diameter, each containing 250,000 tons of earth and stone, moved over quite a good distance. In the case of Newgrange, quite substantial distances, the stone was brought to the site for the construction. But unlike, say, for instance, the pyramids, where you have very, very straight cut stone, the monuments of Brú na Bóinne were built sort of organically, as it were, without shaping the stones or cutting the stones. There was a feature or a decorative process called pick dressing, where, they would pick away at the surface of a stone, but that was just dressing. That wasn't an attempt to shape the stone. So that, I think, tells you immediately an awful lot about the people who built it. I think that's a whole discussion that would occupy several hours about, whether the people communally came together to build these things, or whether they were coerced under a hierarchy, and latest evidence would suggest the latter. But anyway, without going there, because we don't want to spoil it, that the fact that they took these stones from nature and didn't want to shape them, I think, is important. And what they did at Newgrange was that they were able to shape a beam of the sun on winter solstice, so that even though it was wide at the entrance through the aperture, the roof box above the entrance, even though it's several feet wide, by the time it gets into the chamber, it's like, I think it's 15 or 17 centimeters wide. And they narrowed that beam using this sinuous curvature of the passage. And again, that was all made with these natural boulders that they had transported by sea and river from a distance of about 20 miles each way, each weighing at least a ton, some of them 2, 3, 4, 5 tons, and the maximum 10 tons. Huge stones. And I think that says quite a lot about what their mindset was. They didn't have metallurgy, so it was harder to cut stone, which is why they were probably more likely to leave it. They were able to build, in the case of Newgrange. Newgrange, by the way, is a medieval name. It was a name given to the area by the Cistercian monks who founded Mellifont Abbey in the 12th century, in 1142 AD. They came from Clairvaux in France. They established farms or granges. The old name of Newgrange, or the old names of Newgrange, are Sheed which means, Sheed or she is like, it's indescribable. I always say there's no adequate translation for it. The best translation is otherworld mounds. And the best sense of what that means is that there were maybe portals or doorways to other realms of consciousness, maybe, but also other realms, as in where you might go after you're dead, kind of thing, because they did, after all, bury their dead in those. And broga being related to an old Irish word, brug, or brew, meaning a mansion or an abode. So another word, abode. And this is very much associated with the gods of the time in the Tuatha De Danann. The chief deity, Dagda, was said to have built Newgrange. His son, Angus, was said to have, well, I suppose you could say, cheated him out of it. He got in there in place of his father. And, of course, Bowen, Trinity, as it were, the prehistoric Trinity. And the fact that it has 3 recesses and is cruciform in shape suggests that they were thinking in Trinitarian terms. The only place in anywhere in Ireland where you can find the triple spiral emblem, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, is at Newgrange, on the entrance curbstone and in a stone in the end recess of the chamber. And it would seem that that's the way they were thinking. So you have this combination of things. Brew, another Irish word which is very similar to brug, is brew, which means womb. Maria Gambutas was the first one to suggest passage tombs should be relabeled passage wombs, because of the idea that, in some parts of the world, when somebody died, there was a celebration because they knew that there was going to be a new life. And when a child was born, there would be a mourning because they knew somebody else's life had come to an end. This being the idea of perhaps relating to reincarnation, the passage womb of Newgrange is the belly of the Earth Mother, who I think would have been Bowen. And that was seen to have been impregnated, as it were, by the sky god, the sky father, the sun father, who was very much associated with the sun because he looked after the crops and the weather, and he was described as being red-faced or having a ruddy countenance. And then the divine offspring, who was Angus, whose miraculous birth was said to have happened at a time when the sun's movement in the sky had been stopped, so that this could occur. And if you think of what a solstice is the stopping of the sun's daily movement along the horizon. So yes, the sun stops when it shines into Newgrange. And there in the mythology, you have, in metaphorical symbolism, the astronomical event described. I don't know if you might call it the mating of the sky and the earth, which may have been seen as a prerequisite to the fertility, the plentiful nature of the next harvest. Because after all, the people who built Newgrange, we're told, were Ireland's first farmers, so they would have been keenly aware of the cycles of the sky and how they affected the cycles that we call the seasons, and the movement of the sun, which at this latitude between 53 and 54 degrees north. And what that means is that on winter solstice, the sun rises roughly in the southeast, and summer solstice, it rises in the northeast. They're almost 90 degrees apart, actually. And that leads to a huge disparity in the length of day from summer to winter. At the moment, over the past few weeks, we've had endless day because it doesn't get fully dark at night at this latitude in midsummer. And then in the winter, those days seem really short and the darkness seems to last forever. No wonder then that you would want to build a giant monument into which the sun shines when it is at its lowest ebb. And the amazing thing about Newgrange is it actually shines brilliantly in there. It's got this magnificent glow about it. It's dazzling. And there's a wonderful warmth to it. You're in the cold interior of the earth womb, and it's pierced by this most magnificent light. And even that, to have witnessed that, I'm sure must have been very moving. And then, of course, the myths created around it to perpetuate it. I hope I've given you a bit of an introduction anyway.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, what really came to me as you were speaking is this connection between womb and tomb, and how, Newgrange embodies both of those aspects as an otherworldly portal, which has all of this beautiful mythology. And I just love, imagining the ancient ancestors looking up at the stars, at the constellations, and looking at the movement of the sun and creating these stories. That's how the mythologies come to be. And then those stories are honored for time immemorial because of these mounds, these beautiful, amazing sacred structures they built. And I think maybe in your book, you talk about how Newgrange is like an astrological observatory. And you just talked beautifully about the alignment of the winter solstice, the sun shining into the womb to create new life. And as I've been reading your book just in the past few weeks, it's really amazing that it actually aligns with other stars and planets as well. So Venus and Sirius and what have you. So it might be just beautiful just to hear just a tiny little bit about that as well.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. I don't think it's coincidental. I don't think that at the time Newgrange was built, the brightest of all of the stars. Now, of course, that does not count the sun, the moon, and the planets of the solar system, because Venus is certainly brighter than Sirius, and I think Jupiter is too. But Sirius, being the brightest of all the stars, shared the same declination as winter solstice sun, meaning that although the sun only shone into Newgrange for a week or two at its lowest ebb, perhaps a week. That's being studied at the moment. Even now, people don't know exactly when the sun first reaches the chamber of Newgrange before solstice and when it retreats out of the chamber again. But the difference between the sun and Sirius back then is that Sirius, every night that it was visible, it would have been visible from the chamber of Newgrange. Now, there would be all sorts of arguments against, well, what's the likelihood of that just being a coincidence and all the rest? Well, I think it's more than that. I mean, first of all, in the mythology, Bowen, you have to understand in Irish myths, there are different names for characters. So Elkmar, who's associated with Newgrange, was also known as Nethan, was also known as Nuadu. Bowen also had another name, which is Ethna, and Ethna was supposed to have come into Newgrange in the form of a dog, which I thought was fascinating. I was wondering, what the hell did that mean? In Island of the Setting Sun, when we published it in 2006, Richard and I speculated that there was 3 dog skeletons found, one outside the threshold of the 3 recesses in the chamber. Buried in the floor of the chamber of Newgrange, there were 3 dogs. And that had been not dismissed, but it had been glossed over as, what probably happened there was they were dogs who kind of found their way in through a small hole into the monument and couldn't get out again over time. But in fact, myself and Richard speculated that they might have been buried there intentionally in ancient times, with the idea that there might have been some association with Sirius. Now, I know that's tenuous, I understand that. You see, if you go back to the rear of the monument, so you come out of Newgrange and you go round to the rear, there's this very heavily decorated curbstones. Newgrange has a sort of what we would call a very ostentatious or particularly developed style on some of its stones that you don't encounter too much anywhere else. And this stone is exactly on the axis of the monument with the entrance curbstone, such that if you get a plan of Newgrange and you draw a line between the entrance curbstone and this curbstone that I'm talking about, which is curbstone number 52, they actually pass up through the passageway and dissect the stone with a triple spiral on it, which is fascinating. But on this stone at the rear, there appears to be a series of depictions of Orion's belt, 3 cup holes in a cartouche, which is something that's, as I said, is very embellished. It's not seen that much. Cup holes are reminiscent of rock art rather than megalithic art. And then there's this other cup hole that appears in several places, but then the largest one is on this line down the middle of the stone. And I just thought, that looks like Orion's belt pointing to Sirius and Sirius lining up with the axis of the monument. And so that's what we speculated was happening. It was only in the interim period, sometime in more recent years, that testing was done on the dog bones. They were indeed found to be prehistoric. They didn't just stumble in there in medieval or modern times and knock it out. It looks like they were some form of votive deposit. And the one about Venus is fascinating because the tradition recorded by none other than the very esteemed Joseph Campbell, the late great Joseph Campbell, was that, and he came to Ireland, and there's a question mark as to exactly where he heard this. Was it somebody local, or did he perhaps access the Folklore Commission archives and find an old document, which is entirely possible because that's the kind of scholar he was. But he said that there's a story about Newgrange that says that on one day out of every 8 years at dawn, Venus, or the morning star as it's called, shines into the chamber of Newgrange and casts a beam onto a stone there. When myself and Richard went and studied this, Venus does have an 8-year cycle in which it goes through what are called 5 synodic periods. It loops around the sun and becomes, for us, an evening object. And then it disappears again into the sun and becomes visible again as a morning object. So evening and morning, that constitutes one. There is an 8-year repeating cycle that looks like, when you plot it out, that looks like the petals of a flower. And on one of those 8 years, on the morning of the solstice, the winter solstice, Venus has enough what we call western elongation from the sun to rise in darkness, but yet have the proper declination to be seen from inside Newgrange. And then later that morning, the sun rises and floods the chamber of Newgrange with its light. And I thought that was just the most remarkable thing, and perhaps that was what was referred to in relation to Bowen or Etna arriving into the monument in the form of a dog, and perhaps that's what the megalithic art means. I do want to say something before I finish on that point, and that is that it's very important that people understand. Some of the experts would have us believe that the ancient astronomers who built these monuments, that their calendar was entirely focused or built around the movements of the sun. And if you're an astronomer and you see all the cycles, and especially the moon and the cycles of the planets, you kind of realize that doesn't really work. That's not very practical, because the only 2 times of the year you can hook your calendar on are the solstices, when the sun stops moving. And if it's cloudy for a week, which it sometimes is in Ireland, and you miss that, it's like, well, which day was the solstice? It's far better to use the moon, especially, which is the basis for Monday, Moon Day, which is the basis for the word fortnight, 14 nights of the moon. And we were using the moon for our calendars up until about 2 or 3 centuries ago. So why would it have been any different then? Why would we have discarded the moon and said, no, it's just the sun, it's just the sun? And in actual fact, what's happening there is the male sun-dominated thinking of the rational scientist wants to depose the female cyclical, menstrual, as it were, moon. And that just gets shoved to one side. But in fact, I think there's enough evidence, I think, circumstantial as it may be, to show that the people who built these monuments were equally interested in what was happening with the moon as they were with the sun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that forward, because it's a question that I often get, actually, and a question that I have is really how the moon and these other celestial bodies and beings played into the ancients' understanding of the cycles. I think it was a lot more complex. You know, if you think about how closely our ancestors were living with the cycles, it makes sense that there would be multiple cycles having that influence and not just one. So I love that you brought that wisdom forward. And if you look at other ancient cultures, I know in Egypt, you know, their new year is when the heliacal rise of Sirius happens and the Nile floods at that time of year, and it's during summer. And so, you know, it just, to me, it points to the fact that the ancients had such an in-depth understanding of all of this. And so living within all of those cycles simultaneously would not have been something difficult as we kind of imagine it might have been, you know? So yeah, thank you so much. And I love that you were bringing forward the suppression of the divine feminine in astrology. And that's something we were briefly talking about before we went live. I'd actually love to ask you about the sacred feminine in the stories of astrology and astronomy of Ireland, because I think that would just be so interesting, since we have so many female listeners and who are impassioned and emboldened by the stories of the sacred feminine.
Yeah, Irish mythology, the reason a lot of it survived is because it was written down by Christian monks in the monasteries of the Middle Ages. I think otherwise we would have lost a huge amount, because the oral tradition was dying out already in the 19th century, and especially at the time of the famine. There was such a huge amount of death, and then emigration, entire rural populations moving away from an area, and thus depriving that area of the folklore and the mythology about it that have been handed down for probably dozens or hundreds of generations even. We kind of naturally sort of forget that. What it seems is that in prehistory, pre-Christian times, we don't know how far back this mythology goes. My own view is that some of the mythology pertaining to the Brunabónia monuments, pertaining to the Tuatha De Danann, actually does go all the way back to the time the monuments were built, because there seems to be information encoded in some of those myths pertaining to the function of the monuments. And I'm not the first one to say that, I won't be the last, but there are very few scholars who will say it. They won't risk their reputation. So there was a pantheon, but also at Brunabónia, as I've already alluded to, I think there was a trinity, what we might call a trinity, or a precursor to what we might call the Holy Trinity. There was the Sky Father, there was the Earth Mother, and there was the divine offspring. And they, I think, are represented in the triple spiral of Newgrange: Dagda, Bowen, Angus. In slightly later mythology, Setanta, the young boy warrior hero who becomes the warrior Cuchulainn, he was also conceived at Newgrange by Dechtina and Lu being another of the great luminaries of the Tuatha De Danann. You see two trinities in which there's a certainly potential Son, Father, Earth Mother, and divine male, usually. The female was Bowen. Now, let me tell you what happened to her. I'm so glad you asked, because it's so important to the work that I've been doing lately. I published a book called Return to Segish in the spring of this year, which is not really fiction or non-fiction. I don't know what you would describe it as. It's a mytho-poetic work looking at the mythology of this landscape and my own experience of it. A huge theme of that work is what happened to Bowen in the mythology. Because what happens to her is she has a love tryst. She has an affair with the Dagda. She's married to Elkmar, but the Dagda desires her, and they go off to Newgrange, which is apparently Elkmar's home, and he's sent away by magic by the Dagda, and he thinks he's only going to be away for one day, but he's actually going to be away for 9 months, which is ironically or interestingly exactly the length of time it takes to bring a child into the world. And so Dagda and Bowen have union at Newgrange. But you see, what's difficult is to disentangle what is original in the story and what is maybe added in by the ecclesiastical scribes, who were working in difficult conditions, who were recording what is ostensibly pagan, pre-Christian mythology within the sacred walls of a monastery, probably being forced or being coerced by a patron who might have been the local king, who was giving them the money and the land to do their thing. So they're kind of having to write this stuff down, and it might be grating against their nerves. And in some cases, they absolutely must have inserted, let's say, some words or made amendations or emendations to the text to make it a little bit more palatable to their Christian worldview. In the case of Bowen, what is contrived is that she went to the well of Necton, her husband, again, another name for Alkmaar, and that only Necton and his 3 cupbearers, who are all male, were allowed to look to the bottom of the well, or were able to look to the bottom of the well. There are none who shall look to the bottom of the well without them being blemished or injured or even destroyed. Bowen goes there according to the mythology, and again, these may have been sort of embellished by the monks, because of her haughtiness and her arrogance and her pride. Of course, what better way to picture the principal feminine deity of the time if you wanted to reduce her stature in Christian times than to say she was a sinner because she slept with a man who wasn't her husband, kind of thing, you know? And there's a contrivance there, I think, which is to make Bowen also go to the well to wash herself of her sin. And that's exactly the word that is used in the mythology. And I have a difficulty with that. I'm inclined to think that that myth is a prehistoric myth. And in fact, it's probably an origin myth. And I've written about that in the Bowen monograph, which is due to arrive from the printer tomorrow as a follow-up, a more scholarly work around this subject. That she went to the well. She basically entered this all-male domain. It would be like a woman walking into a Catholic mass in which the priest is obviously male, surrounded by male attendants. And that she proceeds to go onto the altar and takes over from him. Anyway, she goes into this all-male domain. She breaches or goes against the taboos or the gyasa, which was that you should only walk around a well, a jeshel, or sunwise or right-hand-wise, clockwise. But she went tuhal or widdershins against the natural order of things. She walked around the well 3 times. And according to the mythology, she said things like, this well has no power over me. It won't blemish me. And when she looked into the well erupted and burst out like a geyser and washed over her. And there are different versions of the myth, but a short version is that she got injured. She was chased by the water as it formed the River Boyne, and she lost an eye, she lost an arm, and she lost a leg. She was carried out as far as the Boyne estuary, where the Boyne meets the sea, and she was drowned. And some of the bits that she dropped on the way, her arm and her leg, gave name to different parts of the river. And that absolutely has echoes of Indo-European creation mythology. In fact, world creation mythology, in which a deity or a monster or some sort of giant is sacrificed or self-sacrificed or dismembered, and its pieces form parts of the new world. So there's this core essence of the Bowen myth, which to me says that it is not only is it very ancient, it's actually a creation myth. It is cosmogonic. It's the cosmogony. It takes us back to what we might call the first time. And every culture had its first time. I don't know if any of your viewers are familiar with the work of Mircea Eliade, but he spoke about the myth of the eternal return. And he spoke about the idea of, the regenerative pattern of the moon, that the moon gets destroyed, as it were, disappears, and then comes back to life. And it does this every month. And that this reminds us of our own natural cycles, not just the cycle of human life from infancy to fullness in middle. I don't know, some people say 33 is the age when you're a full moon. And then from there, it's kind of downhill, because you're getting older and you're getting more rickety every day and slower and mentally and everything else. And eventually you die, And what happened with the Bowen story is that there's a death and there's an end of things, but there's also, of course, that is what is it called? A sine qua non, or it's a prerequisite. It's an absolutely fundamental requisite of the beginning of a new cosmos. And that's why I call it the first time, because I think that's what Eliade calls it, the idea of a first time. So far from going to the well because she apparently sinned, which is a very Christian idea, and superimposing that on something that was probably several thousand years older. In fact, she was going to the well as the white cow, I think, because Bowen means white cow, and the white cow is the moon. And the moon is seen, as I said, to be born as a slender crescent that looks like the cow horns. I saw it, I don't know if any of you saw it last night, in the twilight in the west. It was beautiful last night and lovely colours in the sky. And then it comes to fullness, and then it sort of gets, you could say it was getting dismembered. It's getting chunks taken off it every day until it's only just a slender crescent left, and then it disappears again. And in Irish, there's a phrase called, and I talk about this in Island of the Setting Sun, there's a phrase called gwynray, which basically means the wounding of the moon, which is the moon in its late phases. And then, of course, the Milky Way being that stream of milk produced by this cow of plenty, but also being the trail of her remnants. Because the Boyne River is Owen Bofina, or, it's Bowen. I mean, it is a riverine personification, if such thing is possible, is a riverine version of the deity, right? But in Irish, the name for the Milky Way, that great river of the sky, is Balach na Bofina, the way of the white cow. And so in her destruction, she creates the Boyne River on the earth, but also the Boyne River of the sky, which in some cultures is seen as either a trail of milk left by the cow or the path that the cow used to trod through the heavens, because, the ecliptic and the Milky Way are at angles to each other. They only intersect in two places, which is also significant. I don't know if that has covered the question in quite the way that you wanted it.
Yes, it was wonderful. Yeah.
It's just that the importance of Bowen, which is just for some reason this year in particular, very early in Return to Segish, 3 chapters in, and all the chapters are quite short. There's a chapter called Bowen Remade. As a poetic exploration of the mythology, I thought about the immensity and the immense importance of what would it mean to us to see Bowen remade. And I can't even sort of logically explain all that. I'm writing another work trying to do that. But just as a sort of a poetic vision or a mythological vision, it's like, what happened to us when we dismembered the feminine deity? We commemorate her by saying the river and Brú na Bóinne in the monuments, but we forget altogether that at one time there were people for whom she was very important. And she has lost that importance. And sure, look, if you could tie it all the way back into the beginning of the conversation. The loss of the feminine has been a great tragedy for mankind. We have adopted this very logical, empirical, left-brained, male-son approach to things. We want to build skyscrapers and we want to fly spacecraft. And now we're at a time where we're going, oh, actually, hang on a second. Was that such a good idea? Because look at all the damage we've done. And the damage isn't just environmental. The damage is psychological and spiritual. Going right back to the start of the conversation, how many people nowadays who live in modern built-up cities have had that experience of stars in a wilderness or a wild or a sort of a barren landscape setting? And the answer is precious few. And that, I think, is where the disparity lies between a culture that worships masculine and feminine deities equally and one that is inclined to worship male very heavily weighted in favour of the male, is that we have lost sight of the Milky Way. We've lost sight of Bowen. We've lost sight of the deity. So, yeah, let's see her remade, refashioned.
Mm. I love that so much, to really feel Bowen as an expression of the goddess, the sacred feminine, who was this very vital aspect of creation to our ancient ancestors. Speculation, but let's say for a moment that she was. And to feel that we're in this amazing time where these stories are kind of having a revival, right? You know, like I know there have been people throughout time in Ireland who have honored these stories, but there is this real upsurge of interest from what I can see and others that I speak to in these stories. And at the same time, there's a revival of interest in the sacred feminine. And I think the two are very related in that, you know, so many women that I work with, I'll just speak from personal experience, you know, they're searching for those different faces of the goddess as aspects of self that are wanting to be remade and reclaimed. So I love that idea of the remaking of Bowen, the remaking of the sacred feminine in this time, alongside of these ancient stories and these myths, because she's really been there all along, is how I see it. She's been there all along, and we're really just reclaiming her and remaking her. So thank you so much for that beautiful, beautiful answer.
Right, welcome. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm just noticing the time and realizing that we are at the end of our hour together. I could talk to you all day. Like I have so many more questions, but but I do just want to give you the opportunity here, Anthony, to kind of wrap up our conversation and tell people where they can find you and about your wonderful books and how people can support the work you're doing as well.
Yeah, sure. I should say, just before we completely close, that movement that you talk about, there is a modern movement in search of something, in search of soul, in search of new meaning, in search of new symbols and icons that work for them, because the old ones seem to be falling away. Well, that in Ireland coincided with several major developments. When I was a child, Ireland was basically a third world country. It's now considered a very modern economy. We've had huge economic development. But we had this crazy period where a lot of things happened. We had a collapse of the financial system. Of course, we weren't the only ones. We had the collapse of the church because the church was mired in scandal, mostly pertaining to paedophile priests, which is utterly awful. We also had a political crisis because the traditional political parties kind of lost their support. And in conjunction with all of that, you had this sort of movement of people away from traditional beliefs in church, in maybe economic institutions and political institutions. And that all hasn't been all good, by the way, because institutions can be good for keeping things sort of structured. But there's been this search for something. And I think that if people haven't sort of moved too extremely, in other words, become atheists who don't believe that there's any deity or there's any... I'm not necessarily don't talk about in terms of belief in deities, but I certainly do talk about in terms of the ability to interact with the divine and to see divine in life and the landscape. But anyway, that's what has happened in Ireland, and we're trying to get to grips with it as well. And I sense that there's definitely a movement back towards the older deities, and that you can actually go to places that were probably sacred to them, and that were there a long, long time before Christianity ever arrived. Without saying anything bad about Christianity, I was raised as a Christian. Anyway, my website is Mythical Ireland. In fact, that's basically Mythical Ireland is how to find me anywhere you want to go. On mythicalireland.com, which is the website, all my books, bar one, the only one that's not available is out of print, is Land of the Ever Living Ones. They're all on there. I can post worldwide from here, and all the books that are bought on Mythical Ireland are signed by myself before I send them away. So I have 9 books. The 9th is due, as I said, from the printer in the morning. I have 9 books, several non-fiction books, several fiction books, and then Return to Segish, which, as I say, doesn't really fit into any sort of neat descriptive box. I'm on social media. I run a weekly live stream on Facebook and YouTube. That's facebook.com/Mythical Ireland. And youtube.com/Mythical Ireland. I'm also on Instagram as Mythical Ireland. I've one of the things that I do is I take a lot of photographs, and I make a lot of videos as well. And so I tend to share those on the likes of Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. And if I could just add, I'm also on Patreon, and I'm very, very grateful for the support of patrons who help with my written and published work and who help with everything that I've been able to do over the past, particularly the past couple of years. And that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mythical Ireland. If you've any questions that you'd like to ask me and that we haven't had time to address tonight, because time flies when you're having fun, you can email me. The email address is mythicalireland@gmail.com. And if I can find the time, I don't always find the time to keep up with the correspondence, but I do my very best to do that. And if I can, I'll maybe interact and give you the answers. Or it's not that I know the answers. I'll try to direct you towards the answers, as it were.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And I just really encourage everyone to go look at, I mean, you have so much work, so much content, such a huge breadth of work. So please do go look at Mythical Ireland. I'm one of the Patreon supporters and love being part of that community. So definitely encourage everyone to look at that as well. And yeah, Anthony, I've been just loving your book, Island of the Setting Sun. So powerful. And thank you so much for being here, Anthony. I can't thank you enough. Yeah,
You're welcome.
So much.
I'm very, very glad to do it. And I hope that it sows some seeds with people.
You've been listening to Dreaming the Ancestors with Tara Brading. My passion is connecting women to the wisdom of their ancestors, specializing in ancestral feminine wisdom from Ireland and England. If you feel called to connect with your Irish ancestry in an embodied, spiritual, feminine way, I lovingly invite you to sign up for my free reclamation journey, which includes a 90-minute video to connect with your Irish ancestry and ancient heritage. And if you hear the call to connect with your English ancestry, I have a 3-hour introductory workshop called Women of the Wells. You can find these offerings at tara-wild.com/get started. To spell that out, that's TARA-WILD.com/get started.